Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar, the 14th event that we've hosted together with HVS, Bird&Bird, AlixPartners and EP. We're joined today by some excellent speakers to provide their insights on the challenges that we face as we look towards 2022 and ask the question, just how will hotels change with innovation, and what's the new thinking is sitting right at the heart of hotels? It's an often cited phrase that things are changing faster than ever before, but is it true? It is certainly interesting to observe how many phrases have now entered the daily narrative and become mainstream. It does indicate that change is happening at speed, and impressively so. For example, consider some of the following terms which weren't even part of the discussion just a decade ago, but are now mainstream. Smart rooms, digital reception, changing work patterns, delivered in food models, experiential social spaces, chief experience officer, food waste technology, and even going green, which really took off after about 2012. A decade ago, the debate across many forums was still whether hotels should charge for the use of Wi-Fi. Doesn't that look outdated now? Today, it's far more about whether guests can bring their own streaming devices, tablet menus within rooms, keyless entry, and voice-activated controls. Guests can even enjoy video chats with concierge and reception from the comfort of their own rooms. The overall experience is changing at some speed, and it's no little surprise that the role of Chief Experience Officer is now being discussed more openly. The consumer today wants to live an experience. All the research is telling us that, and to have their expectations met. So is it a surprise that we need a new role focused just on that? It'll be interesting too to see how hotels evolve services to meet the challenges of changing work patterns. Will there be far more co-working spaces open up across hotels? Will we see more hotels simply evolve their in-room facilities and abilities? Will people mix work and play far more in the working day, the same day? What else will we see? Will we see more robotics take place in hotels in both for cleaning and for room service? Well, will more developed fitness centers be emerged to meet the needs of the modern guests? New personalized services emerge to make the guests feel even more welcome. More advanced in-room facilities, such as stronger coffee machines and technology. More delivered in food products, stronger energy management, interactive art and cultural experiences which reflect the local community. Where does it end? The industry is advancing at some speed. It can be argued that this may be a new golden era for innovation within hotels. This is certainly a space worth watching. However, before we talk of any golden age, there are still a number of major challenges that to be faced over the next year. So what does 2022 hold for the hotel industry? We're delighted to welcome you today and ask if you have any questions, please do ask through the Q&A channels and button, and we will strive to answer all your questions, either during the session today live or after as well, rest assured. Now, may I have the pleasure, I have the honor to ask Ollie Freestone, the Director of Technology with Digital and Technology with AlixPartners, to come and join me. Ollie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Just checking you can hear me.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon all. Pleasure to be here. It would have been lovely to meet you in person, and I hope the irony of talking about disruption and adapting to it is obvious given the late switch in format for today's session. As Chris said, my name is Ollie Freestone. I'm a director in AlixPartners Digital Technology Practice, and my focus is on consumer-facing industries and retail in particular. And today I'm going to spotlight some key trends in this space and also share some thoughts on the opportunities for the hotel industry, which will hopefully serve as food for thought for the follow-on sessions you have this afternoon. Before we get into the trends themselves, I just wanted to share a thought about the pace of disruption and its impact across sectors. As Chris has alluded to, over the last 2 decades or so, driven by really successive waves of technological innovation, whether that's across computing, energy, biology, manufacturing, we've seen what tech author and entrepreneur Azim Azhar has recently referred to as the emergence of an exponential gap. And this is really where the institutions who follow at the bottom of this chart, the dotted linear path of adapting, are at real risk of being outpaced by the wider changes going on around them. And they start to suffer from a bit of a drift effect. And as the expectations of customers, suppliers, investors, and other groups outpace their ability to execute, it's creating a gap between traditional businesses, where change can take months and often many years, and those who can adapt and evolve at remarkable speed and follow more of the exponential line. I'm thinking here of the Amazons, the Apples, the Alibabas of this world, who really understand the opportunity in the exponential curve. So it's against that backdrop of accelerating change, I'm going to share a few themes that we're observing at the moment. And the first is really the increasing shift online. So recent data from Ofcom shows how the trend for time spent online has grown over the last 2 to 3 years. We're spending more time here across our devices, and our dependence on online services has grown, whether that's for entertainment, shopping, keeping in touch, getting information, gaming, homeworking. And many of you will remember the challenges of homeschooling. And if it was possible, at the center of this, from a device access perspective, the role of the smartphone has got even bigger. There's almost 55 million users of smartphones in the UK. It's pretty ubiquitous. 99% of those aged 16 to 34 and 96% of those between 35 and 54 years of age own one. And UK internet users spend nearly 4 times as much time on smartphones than on their computers. And interestingly, the highest growth area for time spent online is not in the kind of Gen Z millennial categories, it's in the 55 plus category. So I guess the thought here is how quickly the hotel industry is adapting to this increased desire for us to be online, the implications on areas like super fast infrastructure, and perhaps more importantly, how you can help customers access their favorite online shops, games, streaming services, and even work applications. And I think as we spend more time online, we're increasingly connecting both consciously and in many cases unconsciously to more and more devices. The average UK home now has around 25 internet-enabled devices. That tally includes computers, tablets, phones, games consoles, smart TVs, other connected devices like security cameras, remote-controlled thermostats. And that equates to somewhere around 700 million nationally. And unsurprisingly, if you're anything like my home, the presence of children increases the number further. So a home with 3 children might typically host over 30 internet-enabled devices. And some predictions suggest in the next 2 to 3 years that could climb as high as 50 as more smart home devices come online. So I think this proliferation of new interconnected devices is creating not only a wave of additional data about what people are viewing and what they're doing, but also an opportunity for a new set of touch points with customers. And as 5G belatedly ramps up, there's huge opportunity to harness the power of the ownership of smart devices. So for hotels, I think tapping potentially into this growing ecosystem could generate enormously valuable insights to provide opportunity to build more personalized experiences. But even though we might be more digitally connected, I think there's also a growing body of evidence to suggest many are feeling more isolated than ever before. So a number of studies are pointing to evidence about increasing loneliness, partly as a result of a reduction in social contact during successive lockdowns. And that impact is particularly acute for working age adults living alone. And it leaves me wondering, do hotels have the space, the facilities to create opportunities for socializing in person and an element of escapism, whether that's from the home or the office itself? Now, successive lockdowns and shifts in how we work and live have also impacted how we consume. It stands to reason if you lock everybody up and you tell them they can't go shopping in person, then something's going to happen. And we're buying online more than ever, as the chart on the left-hand side shows. And on the chart on the right, smartphones are starting to dominate as the primary device through which we do our shopping. Beyond the headlines of exponential Amazon growth, there are lots of other adjacent innovations that are emerging around the trend for online shopping, whether that be re-engineered packaging for online purchase and delivery, collection and return hubs outside the office or home, growing influence of online and largely faceless reviews and recommendations, and a truly cashless customer journey in some instances, which all essentially amounts to better online experience for consumers. And I think within that, there's some interesting pointers which the hotel industry might want to look at and think about how they can use those as opportunities in terms of step changing the online experience. I mentioned the cashless theme. Cash usage will continue to drop in the UK over the coming years. Some estimates predict the share of cash as a percentage of total payment transactions is going to be as low as 7% in the next couple of years. It's up around 14% at the moment. International figures show that in several other countries, Sweden, Canada, Australia, already less than 1 in 10 shop payments are made in cash. And there's some predictions that Sweden will be almost cashless by 2024. The payments landscape as well is evolving really fast. You can already see the likes of Apple and Amazon and others are looking to end the dominance of some of the traditional players, some of the traditional intermediaries in the value chain and their high fees by launching their own payment services to reduce the use of physical cards and cash. And in retail, we're also seeing expansion of trials such as checkout-free stores. Holborn in London is a particularly hot area at the moment, with Amazon, Tesco and Sainsbury's all trialling checkout-free stores, where they require an app to log in to go into the store, but payment is then automated on exit. No need for cash or cards at all. And we're going to potentially see some of those trends finding their way into the whole hotel industry through new forms of cashless payment. Especially prominent in retail and hospitality is the rapid re-engineering of supply chains, and in particular focus on last mile delivery. So the global online food delivery market is expected to show compound annual growth of 10% plus between this year and 2025, and the UK is seeing similarly rapid expansion, and that's largely driven by increasing smartphone penetration, changing lifestyles, the growth of quick commerce, as it's called. So I want something within the next 10 to 15 minutes, and the impact of COVID-19 are all factors. And also autonomous delivery is an interesting area gaining traction through many ongoing trials. So some of you who may live or commute around Milton Keynes might be familiar with these little robots on the right hand side, run by the company Starship. They've got a collaboration with Co-op where they will deliver bags of shopping to your home or your office. Ocado is trialing autonomous vehicles with a company called Wave. And again, is there an opportunity here for hotels to look at how they leverage their assets and their facilities? One example might be dark kitchens where they prepare food for home delivery in addition to serving guests in their establishments. So just a quick segue from the physical world to the virtual. Online entertainment and experience has grown in all forms. Admittedly, a bit of a buzzword at the moment, the metaverse, but it may finally bring some respectability to all the disparate virtual reality and augmented reality applications we've seen being released in recent years, bringing them together in a bit more of a cohesive landscape. And certainly there's evidence some big brands are betting on things moving that way. Nike, Balenciaga, Gucci, Vans have all created their own worlds within, whether it's games like Fortnite or platforms such as Roblox. And interestingly, Nike recently filed a trademark application looking at downloadable virtual goods, retail store services, entertainment services. So they're looking at this really closely and have also recently launched on the Roblox platform at Nikeland, where fans can kind of connect, create their own virtual clothing and trainers, share experiences and compete in online games. And I think online gaming is a really interesting example where brands are thinking hard about where they're going to sit on it. More people are spending more time online gaming, and the appeal is widening beyond just younger cohorts. And the other thing that's worth mentioning around content is content consumption continues to gather pace, with millions of users generating their own content, as you're aware, on TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, using the power of technology to deliver really high quality user generated content, and increasingly, interestingly, shopping experiences through that content and those platforms. So it does leave me wondering, is there an opportunity here for hoteliers to use the virtual to promote the physical experience, and maybe even vice versa? And as a consequence of some of these themes, more time spent online, more connected devices, more and more data is being created, stored and shared. And it's amazing how much some of these platforms know about you. But consumers are becoming increasingly savvy, I think. There's an expectation that there'll be some kind of exchange that's undertaken with some platforms here. So expectation that you will do something valuable for me in exchange for my data. It might be a new feature, it might be a new trial, it might be a discount. And for hotels, how much are we thinking about how they might reimagine that value exchange with guests? On the right-hand side, of course, there's a continued consumer interest in privacy. The onus absolutely on businesses to do more with their data security and make this a bigger priority. And no surprise, every week there's a new story emerging about a breach somewhere with significant consequences for those impacted. If I take a little bit of a step back from a lifestyle shake-up perspective, whether it's people creating kind of man caves at the bottom of their garden or she sheds, increasing numbers of multi-generational households, single-person homes, I think what's changed through the pandemic, it's prompted everyone to adjust in some way the way they live. And that's given brands new consumer segments to look at, new trends to consider, and areas such as kind of domestic holiday seekers or changes in how we work have really provided some interesting opportunities. I'd take camping as an example. Last year, domestic camping enjoyed record growth, significant uptake at the luxury end of the market, along with ancillary markets like camping accessories, motorhomes. Interestingly, PE Group CVC recently invested in holiday park operator Away Resorts, and then they acquired Aria Resorts, and in doing so created one of the UK's largest holiday resort brands. Maybe hotels should also be thinking, if they've got significant grounds, how are they going to use their assets in a different way to cater from some of these emerging markets? And if we look at the work side of life, it's interesting to see how many companies are thinking about using office space less than they do at the moment. What we're seeing as a result of that is some cities, Zoopla recently released a report showing Manchester, Leeds and Birmingham experiencing a bit of a halo effect, where commuting zones on the outskirts of those cities are getting noticeably stronger rental demand than the central zones themselves. And it brings into question, really, as Chris said at the beginning, the role of the office. It's up to the debate, I think. Shifting the requirements around city centre offices are contributing to a bit of a donutting effect in some cities as workers change their work patterns. Could hotels start to explore a different kind of corporate client arrangement, pay-as-you-go space or co-working hubs? I think that's an interesting space to explore as companies look to downsize their office space. And of course, we can't get away from mentioning sustainability. Certainly in the retail and CPG sector, the chart on the left is a study from NYU Stern in the States, looking at different categories of sustainably marketed products. And while still accounting for a relatively smaller share of the US market, the growth is coming from sustainably marketed products. So between 2015 and 2019, those products delivered around 55% of CPG market growth across the categories in the study. That's growing 7% faster than products not marketed as sustainable, and there's a significant price premium there as well. And it's interesting as well when you catch that against, there's a pull factor there from the market, from consumers downstream, but there's also a push factor in terms of areas such as the SEC considering mandatory disclosure, and a lot of push there around various areas of ESG to explore. It's a consistent theme now with almost all institutional investors. So that was a high-paced canter through 10 themes, which I hope will provide ample food for thought. I'll circle back to this simple chart, but I'll leave you with the idea that the exponential era is just getting started. And whilst we talked about a gap at the beginning, we really think there's an opportunity there if you look at the trends around speed of diffusion of innovations, advances in the power of computing, the speed with which new entrants, new companies, new challenges have emerged and taken market-leading positions. I think there's much more to come, and kind of could this decade be the new roaring 20s is what I'll leave you with.
Ollie, that was excellent. Thank you. Oh, I'll get myself on camera in a second. He says. That was excellent. I suppose a couple of questions quickly. You give me loads to think about there. So I suppose the first one is city centres are going to struggle, aren't they? They're going to take time to get back up and running. And yet there's so much density of hotels with city centres. Are they going to be forced, I guess, to change, aren't they, at some speed? And are you seeing that? I suppose that's the other question.
Yeah, well, definitely it start kind of commuting into the city, still going 3 or 4 times a week and seeing how few people there are around and how many places seem to be kind of closed for business. I think, like many others, I think they have to adapt. They have to look at the footprint they've got, the amenities, and start to think about adjacencies and what they could use that space for. It's challenging as well, I guess, with the less international travel. But I mean, retailers have been very good at kind of looking at, okay, we've got a set of assets, what can we do with those? So I think that would be the thinking. I think, like, think a bit laterally about what you can do with that space.
I mean, retailers have done a lot of work because they're obviously under great pressure. Are you seeing the same in hotels now? Are you seeing that trend of interest?
As in hoteliers doing
beginning to think this way.
Yeah, I think so. I think seen emergence of, certainly in the kind of working space, work hubs, thinking a bit more about how can you look at the idea of taking a hotel room overnight, well, actually maybe breaking that up into segments and say, maybe I just want to go and use a quiet space for the day. Maybe I just want to use some of the facilities. Maybe I don't want to spend a traditional kind of night or 2 nights in a hotel. I do see some of that emerging. I think that'll be a big trend for the future.
Look, Ollie, thank you so much. That was excellent, really. There will be questions coming up, I'm sure. You could have a look and answer as well. So
no problem.
My thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, can I ask Kate Nicholls to come forward? Kate, as many will know, is the Chief Executive of UKHospitality, has been really the industry spokesperson over the last couple of years and really challenging government, working with government on the key issues that we've all been facing. And we'll talk to, hello Kate, lovely to see you. And will now give us a presentation talk about what she's seeing, and the picture she's seeing ahead of us, and what we've probably got to start thinking about. Over to you, Kate.
Okay. Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you for inviting me here today. Only sorry that we can't be doing this in person for obvious reasons, but nevertheless, it's great to be able to join you and to give you my perspective from the trade association point of view across the breadth of hospitality sector of the impact of the pandemic, the challenges we're facing, and the current work that myself and my team are doing to be able to make sure that we have strong representation into government to get the policies that we need to allow the industry to be able to recover and to rebuild after a devastating period of time with the COVID crisis. Just by way of introduction, for those of you who don't know who we are, UKHospitality is a national trade body representing hospitality operators and employers. We have 700 member companies. Between them, they operate just under 100,000 outlets, primarily pubs, bars, restaurants, nightclubs, hotels, holiday accommodation, but also visitor attractions and the broader visitor economy and tourist businesses. So that roughly is about 95% of the marketplace, and with everything from a single site right the way through to the national chains. We have a second strand of membership, which is professional advisors and suppliers to the industry, and that enables us to provide a holistic support network, both for the supply chain, which has been devastated by COVID just as much as the operators have, but also to make sure that we've got a collaborative approach to be able to develop solutions and policy proposals, as well as to assist with compliance and to provide those insights and intelligence that operators need to be able to grow and rebuild their businesses. So if anybody would like to be in touch to explore more about what membership can do, I'm very happy to take that conversation offline. During the course of the pandemic, we've been very closely involved in talking to government. Our role primarily as a trade association pre-COVID is to promote the sector as a great place to grow, work and invest, to be able to provide support to operators to help them and insight to operators to help them grow their business, to be that pioneering thought leader on the challenges we face, particularly around recruitment, people, employability and the sort of industry brand, as it were, and carbon net zero, as well as preventing unnecessary costs of doing business by campaigning against government legislation or campaigning for positive changes. So as you can imagine, this has been a very full-on 20 months. My first meetings on COVID with government started on 28th of January, and really they are ongoing to this day, usually about 3 to 4 ministerial meetings a week that we've been averaging in order to be able to get the views of the industry across. Now, clearly, COVID has had a devastating effect on the sector. 20 months of below profitability trading and heavy losses, and over the course of the summer, a stuttering start to the recovery process where pandemic, labour shortages and supply chain challenges have meant that we're not performing at optimal efficiency. We're not able to perform at full capacity and to meet the demand that is out there. The positives are that there is quite a good amount of consumer demand. It's variable across the course of the country, and it's variable across the type of business that you've been seeing operating. But around the sort of leisure facilities, the holiday accommodation, the staycation market, people have been able to get to 70–80% occupancy and revenue levels. Same for high street hospitality. City centre businesses faring much more badly, with around 40–60% of normal levels. And positively coming out of the engagement that we've had with government in terms of next steps, we now have a tourism recovery strategy that forecasts and provides independent forecasts suggesting that domestic tourism will recover to 2019 and levels of revenue and footfall by the end of 2023, and international by the end of 2024. Now, that tourism recovery strategy commits the government to working with the industry to develop solutions to bring forward that recovery date by a year. But that still means that you've got a long period of time, even if we manage to deliver that, for the industry to continue operating under the shadow of COVID. And my job is really to try and ensure that the industry staves off a sort of economic long COVID. So we've had a four-pronged approach. It's mirrored in the language of the Tourism Recovery Plan and the Hospitality Recovery Strategy, which were published by government in May and June this year. First of all, it's about reopening, making sure that businesses can open fully and open without those restrictions. And clearly that's been knocked off track this week with the announcements around the Omicron virus and the return of travel restrictions and some legal restrictions in England. Clearly, legal restrictions have remained in place, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, although they have been relatively minimal, they have been significant in terms of the economic impact. And there's 2 points to make in terms of the reopening and keeping businesses open. I think it's open but tied with one hand behind your back in terms of costs, and the impact, more importantly, on consumer confidence, which we have seen this week, where despite the fact that restrictions aren't imposed on the sector and the sector is allowed to remain open, consumers catch a cold very, very quickly when people talk about potential knockback, greater transmissibility. Even masks being worn on the tube and in supermarkets has a knock-on effect on people's confidence about going out to meetings and going out to public spaces. So clearly the recovery, not as strong as had been anticipated by government, hasn't had the flight path that was an upward trajectory only from the summer when we reopened, and now slightly knocked off track at what should be our busy trading period. The key areas that we've been seeing that will be hit, the most concerning, I think, in terms of longer term consumer confidence is around international travel. We know that any element of in-country testing for inbound visitors, particularly for short haul business travellers, is a real deterrent, and we've seen cancellations in hotels and international travel coming through on the back of the new travel restrictions and the return of day 2 testing and PCR testing and isolation until negative. Put simply, people won't travel to the UK while that is still in place, unless they're staying here for longer term activities. But for business travel and for short destination travel, that's too much of a risk to be able to take, particularly in the run up to Christmas, where people worry about coming over for a weekend and getting caught here and not being able to return home. So the cost of testing is off-putting in terms of the travel industry, but that potential deterrent effect likely to last longer and will be a global challenge going into the first half of next year too. Secondly, you've got for the business activities, still having this reticence about work from home and the return of work from home, and the possibility under the government's Plan B economic plan, if we have to go to further restrictions, that they would return to a work from home mandate, still deterring an awful lot, not only of people going into the office, which has an impact on city centre businesses, but also cancelling meetings, still being nervous about establishing major business conferences and events. And we know that those have a 6 to 9 month lead-in time. So a cold on the confidence about booking that will have a longer term deterrent effect as well in terms of booking and slow down the recovery. And then finally, you've got restrictions around mass events. The threat of vaccine passports, COVID status certification, it's in place in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. It's seeing revenues and footfall depressed by about 20 to 30%. And the cost of doing business and having the staff to be able to check COVID status certification significant. And again, while that swirls around as a potential threat that might hit the industry, those major events won't restart. And until we get all three of those elements moving in tandem, mass events, business events, international travel, we aren't going to really see much recovery in the hotel space, and particularly the city centre space, until much later in next year. So the second area that we work with government on is about rebuilding resilience, particularly around financial resilience. In contrast to the rest of the economy, where corporate deposits are twice the level of corporate borrowings, in hospitality, and particularly in sort of property intensive parts of hospitality, it's exactly the opposite. So corporate borrowings twice the level of twice the level of corporate deposits in the hospitality sector, and that requirement to service the debt, the repayment of debt that needs to take place over the next 18 months to 2 years, is going to be significant in being able to impinge upon the ability to grow and to invest and to do Capex in the existing estate. So that investment slowed down, and that ability to be able to ease the cash flow crisis and repair shattered balance sheets difficult as well. So we've worked really hard, and for the first time we've got legislation going through the House of Commons early next week, looking at rent arbitration to try and resolve part of that debt. The sector as a whole has about £10 billion of COVID related debt. About 3 billion of that is outstanding rent that still needs to be resolved, and the protections for businesses about debt repayment fall away in March. So really critical we get an arbitration system in place to allow people to resolve that rent debt. Otherwise that could trigger, as part of the cliff edge that we've got in March, some business failures going forward. As well as the debt and rent repayment moratorium, you've got business rate bills kicking back in, although the Chancellor did talk about 50% rate relief for hospitality businesses for 2022-23, that is capped at £110,000 per business, not per premises. And so a lot of hotels will not be getting maximum 50%, and a lot of hospitality businesses will certainly not be getting anywhere near that, particularly if they're multi-site businesses. So you've got that second element of a cliff edge in March next year when those business rates hit. And then the third element that we're working at pace on is the cost price inflation coming down through the supply chain, working with the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and the Cabinet Office on a task force chaired by Dave Laws, to be ex of Tesco, to be able to look at the pressures and the problems that are in the supply chain that are resulting in cost price inflation, and what that means for pricing decisions for hospitality operators in the first quarter of next year, and potentially then for consumer price inflation across the broader economy, and the impact that then that has on interest rates and debt service repayments longer term into the second half of next year. What we do know is that across hospitality, cost price inflation is currently running at about 13%. 11% increase in wage costs, 8% increase in food costs, about 5% increase in property costs, and 50 to 100% in utilities. So all of those cost pressures building as a great balloon of costs within the system, are likely to burst into the new year when we start seeing that pass through to customers, and that difficult balancing act between how much can you put prices up, which could deter demand, versus the erosion of margin that people are seeing across their businesses, which is really extreme. So we are working to be able to talk to the government about better business rate solutions, root and branch reform of business rates, and crucially maintaining that lower rate of VAT to help the businesses navigate that and not worsening a bad situation by increasing taxes. Thirdly, it's about recovery and how we can get the government to support us in driving demand. Now, clearly, the biggest issue that you can have in demand drivers is that lower rate of VAT to keep us price competitive from an international perspective, but also the inhibitors to demand at the moment. The single biggest issue that operators are talking about is the fact that they don't have sufficient staff to be able to meet the current levels of demand. Now, that's before Omicron and the cancellations that have been reported in the press this week and the suppression of demand that might come about as a result of those changes of restrictions. But prior to that, going into Christmas, our busiest trading period, hoteliers were reporting turning away room bookings, turning away restaurant bookings, closing restaurants for part of the week, and also refusing event bookings because they simply didn't have the staff to be able to manage it. Staff vacancies in the sector running currently at 10%. It has been as high as 14%, and no sign of that easing as we go further forward. So challenges there with record levels of vacancies and a very tight labour market coming out of the COVID process. And then finally, it's about making sure we've got resilience and a renaissance within the sector that we can deliver back again the record levels of growth that we've been able to deliver for government, and making sure that what's at risk for government when we talk to them about the situation and all of the cost pressures and the challenges that I've just outlined, if we have the right level of government support, critically through VAT, business rates, but alternatively levers that will free up the labour market to be able to allow us to meet demand and trade our way out of this, then we will be able to go back to not only a resilient industry, but an industry that contributes positively to the government's agenda, notably in levelling up, delivering jobs, growth and investment at pace across all parts of the country, tourism and the visitor economy and hospitality, critical to that, critical to creating the kind of places that people want to work, live and play, to developing private sector services that may create attractive communities and areas where you've got civic pride, as well as creating those local jobs. And in the next year, particularly important as well to make sure that we have a strong, resilient hospitality industry that can play its part in promoting global Britain on the world stage, hosting the Commonwealth Games, the Platinum Jubilee, those major events, and returning us to a level of inbound tourism that gets us back to being the third largest export earner in the country. So a real message back to the government that if you support the hospitality sector, if you support and drive demand in inbound tourism in particular, then you will be able to get back to an industry that grows at 5% year on year, generates 1 in 6 of net new jobs, invests £10 billion in our high streets and local communities, and as I say, plays a part in delivering meaningful change, whether that's recruitment and the high wage, high skill economy, moving towards that, whether that's carbon net zero, whether that's levelling up. We are an important partner to government, and they need to support us to enable us to play our part in delivering those objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was excellent. As always, telling us exactly the raw truth. First question, obviously, from the panel, unsurprisingly, is: are the government doing anything, do you believe, in terms to help us on the skill shortages? Will they do
government are working with us in some of the areas. Some of these will be longer term issues that take time to resolve. So we have worked closely with DWP, which is Department of Work and Pensions. They look after Job Centre Plus, and they've worked to put and profile hospitality across all Job Centre Plus, across all work coaches, as being a priority area for redeployment, returners to the workforce, and those who sadly been made redundant. So they are proactively pushing the opportunities in hospitality, and they've got a detailed brief from us about the skilled roles that are available. Secondly, we've worked with the Department for Education to make sure that hospitality qualifications are part of the lifelong learning guarantee, so that people can access free money from the government to pay for in-work training and continuous professional development. And then thirdly, working with them around apprenticeships to be able to look again at the rules and regulations around apprenticeships to be able to encourage more people to take them up, but also using Kickstart and the apprenticeship funds that the government is giving to small businesses in particular, £4,000 per apprentice that people take on, to be able to bring forward and upskill a UK domestic workforce. Now, the challenge there is, clearly, if you've closed an industry down for 2 years, best part of 2 years, and you've closed down our vocational training in catering colleges, you don't have that talent pipeline. So we will have a 2-year hiatus in the talent pipeline. We're therefore talking to the government about how the immigration system could be reformed and made more effective to deliver a bridge to get to that higher wage, higher skill economy and investment in the domestic workforce that the government is looking to aspirationally as part of its policy. But I don't see any short-term fix in sort of opening the immigration system up, allowing mass unskilled immigration. I think that the focus will be around the skilled visa routes and making sure that those are more workable, looking at bureaucracy, looking at cost, to be able to help bring skilled workers into the country. So I don't see a short-term fix there, but the government is keen to work with us, does understand that this is holding back economic growth now.
Thank you. Look, it must have been incredibly challenging last 2 years for you. It must have been. Looking forward, are you optimistic about where how the industry will come out, or are you still deeply concerned?
Well, I tend to, it depends which day you catch me on. I tend to be quite optimistic. I'm more optimistic today because we've had very positive endorsements from the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary about not having further restrictions, no need for people to cancel Christmas bookings, Christmas meetings, parties. The measures they've taken, they think, are proportionate and will be sufficient to keep Omicron under control. So I'm confident we're moving out of pandemic into endemic, and therefore the industry can have a breathing space to recover. The pessimistic side of me says that if we are going to beat those international forecasts, bring forward our recovery by a year, it's going to require investment in hard cash from the government. And I don't see the Chancellor opening up the purse strings to be able to fund the industry in the way that it needs. If you look at a simple measure around international marketing, New York has a £30 million budget to market itself internationally. It was out in market looking at attracting back international visitors in April this year. When we reopened the bilateral corridors across the Atlantic, they had marketing materials all over. You couldn't move around any London stations. We don't have any international marketing budget at the moment for London. And £30 million is more than the entire marketing budget for Visit Britain as a whole, let alone one city. So we are up against it, and we will need to have that kind of demand-driven investment. But also, I think you're going to need that support either in the form of enhanced business rates or VAT or both. And the public finances are quite challenging at the moment.
Okay, thank you so much. That was an excellent. Thank you. That's really enjoyable. And thank you for your input today. Can I ask now Karen Freed to come to the fore? Karen's a partner of Bird&Bird and obviously one of our great partners and colleagues and hosts, and she'll be hosting the panel. So over to you, Karen. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Chris. Can I ask our panelists to unmute and switch their videos on now, please? Thank you very much. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists first of all, and then we've got some great questions for them today, which will follow on from a lot of the great input we've already had from Ollie and from Kate. I'd like to start with David Kellett. David's the Senior Director of Hotel Transactions for the Hotel Fund Management Team at Invesco Real Estate IRE, a dedicated specialist team who manage IRE's investment in the hotel real estate sector. David himself has 19 years of transaction experience, focused on real estate, hospitality and leisure for the last 14 of those. And prior to joining IRE in November 2018, David was at Intercontinental Hotels Group. My second panelist today is Eric Jafari, who's the co-founder behind Eden, Lock Hotels, the Moorgate and Birch. Eric is the creative director and chief development officer at Eden, overseeing a development of £1 billion plus, a portfolio of design-led hotels and apartments across the UK, Ireland, Portugal, Germany, the Netherlands and Denmark. Eric and his team are responsible for the acquisition and development of each property as owner-operator through to concept curation, ensuring that each property delivers a unique indigenous experience. Next, we have Russell Kett, who will be known to many of you, chairman of the London office of HVS. Having joined the firm in 1995, he became chairman in 2012. Russell has over 40 years specialist hotel consultancy, investment and real estate experience, advising hotels, serviced apartments and hostel companies, as well as banks, developers and investors on all aspects of their hospitality industry related interests throughout EMEA. Russell, as we know, is a frequent writer, moderator and speaker on the international hotel industry, especially topics relating to valuation, investment, marketing and finance. And I can also personally attest to the fact that Russell is a fabulous pianist and an equally fabulous singer, but unfortunately we won't be able to see those skills on display today. My final panelist is Faraz Nagri, who's the founder of the Lean Kitchen Network and Future Food Brands. Faraz has a background in strategy and performance improvement, having previously advised hospitality and tech companies across the world. More recently, he's an active angel investor, I love that expression, in the tech, healthcare and food startup world. In 2018, Faraz founded the Lean Kitchen Network, whose ambition is to help kitchen operators reimagine their operating models to drive a better customer experience, as well as improved profitability throughout their food offer. He's also a founder of Future Food Brands, who develop new and innovative food brands, recipes and menus for partners all over the world. And Faraz is currently working with branded operators across the UK, such as Holiday Inn, Mercure, Crown Plaza and a number of independents. So we have a great panel for you today, and without further ado, I'd like to get on to our first question, which is actually one that I'd like to address to each of our panelists. And I think we've got a great scene setter from Ollie here, in that we can all now be positively, hopefully looking forward to the roaring 20s. So I thought that was a great way to kick off the positive conversation I hope we're going to have. So each of you, what does each panelist consider to be the single biggest threat and the single biggest opportunity facing the hotel sector in 2021, which you personally see as a key to recovery? So perhaps Russell, would you like to give us your views on that one first?
Okay, thank you, and please, if you ever do this again, just cut my introduction to the name of the company. I've never been so embarrassed in my life. Single biggest threat, I'm afraid, still remains staffing and recruitment. And I'm sorry if I've stolen everybody else's thunder, but that's the advantage of going first. Biggest opportunity, I think, is the huge pent-up demand that exists, both within this country for being able to travel within this country, but particularly from international visitors to be able to come here and to be able to get back to some sense of normality, whether it's for leisure reasons, whether it's for business reasons, whether it's for conference and MICE reasons. That pent-up demand, I think, is huge. Thank you, Russell. David, would you like to comment?
I was going to say labour shortages were the biggest threat to the industry. So I think the, and I mean, you could also say it's government. I mean, it could be government across all of Europe, in that until we're free of the virus, it's very hard for an industry like this to recover properly. So I'm not blaming the government. I think they actually responded very well. But as soon as you see changes in travel requirements and needing to test, you get it's like panic buying, right? You get the wrong reaction from consumers, which hits everybody on this call extremely hard, extremely quickly. So I think labour is the biggest issue, and I'm sure others will say the same. I think the biggest opportunity for me is actually probably in the technology space, and that there's really, out of most crises, you drive a lot of innovation. And I think that's sort of what I would expect, is that actually we see that coming through, and that excites me, because you see change, and and people hate change, and actually it's a good thing, but you need stuff like this to make it happen. So the pandemic is awful, the crisis is awful, but to me the opportunity is that things will change as a result of it.
Thank you. And those themes, labour, tech, innovation, they're things that we'll come on to and hopefully explore in greater detail. Eric, would you like to share your thoughts with us, please?
Yeah, I'm actually just going to piggyback. I'm going to piggyback on what both Russell and David have said. I mean, and I'm going to my answer is going to merge the two, which is opportunity and crisis. I mean, the reality is, from my perspective, limitation is the mother of creativity. And if you look at the past few, the bigger the disruption, the greater the innovative period. The Renaissance was preceded by the Black Plague. The Roaring '20s, which was alluded to, was preceded by the Spanish flu, which wiped out 25% of the population. And so I think one of the things that we suffer from as an industry is that, from my perspective, and this may offend some of the people in the crowd, is that hotels tend not to be very innovative. We tend to be fairly archaic in our way, especially in comparison to some of the other sectors that are out there. And this labor shortage and some of the other challenges that we're currently facing, as David has alluded to, is going to force that change, is going to force us to evolve. I think one of the things I do want to talk about just quickly, and I'll revisit this a little bit later, is the fact that why is the labor shortage happening? And I think there's this assumption amongst most of us that, well, we could just throw money at it and that's enough. But if you look at some of the reports that have recently been released, money is actually not a solution in and of itself. That a lot of the reasons for why people are leaving their jobs isn't just because of the money, it's because of the fact that the job isn't providing that degree of fulfillment that they would have hoped. And so I think a lot of the questions in response to the labor shortage need to go beyond, is it temporary? And I don't think it's temporary. And two, how do you create a work environment that retains and champions a workforce? The last thing, and I'll pass it on. If you look at the last credit crisis, which was kind of the Lehman crisis, a lot of the power shifted from the employees to employers. And so in response to that, people were willing to put up with a lot. This crisis has shifted the power. Literally, the pendulum has swung completely the other direction, whereas a lot of the power is basically gone back to the employees. So it'll be interesting seeing how that manifests itself.
That's a great observation. Thank you. So that sort of concept of the pandemic being a catalyst for people looking at different things in what they get out of their jobs, for example. I think that's a really great topic for us to explore in a minute or two. Faraz, what about you? What would you see as the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity?
So I think, connecting to what some of the other panelists have said, inability to move at pace and change, I think, is a big risk to businesses. So making sure that they can build in that muscle, the capability within the operating model to be able to adapt with changes that are coming. And obviously it's the labor shortage that we're talking about today, because it's really hitting us and really affecting us. It could be changes in trends and preferences. It could be food costs and more supply chain issues. I think one thing that the last 18 months has shown us that we never know what to expect next, and things we didn't think were possible have proven to be possible. So I think, if the businesses of tomorrow are not really thinking about how to build that muscle and that capability into their core around how to deal with change at pace, I think that's a big threat for those businesses going forward, and it's going to be more important than ever. And there's a number of opportunities that kind of could come from this. To pick a couple, one is, and specifically thinking about food and hotels, which is the area I spend most of my time thinking about. Connecting with local is an example of an opportunity, I think, and especially thinking about new ways of connecting the food offer and the food experience with that local community, because they're pandemic proof in a way. They're living there and they're staying there around their hotel. So diversifying, like de-risking the business model a little bit with that. Ollie talked about digital presence. So there's a huge opportunity, I think, for certain hotels that aren't focused on that to really think about how their brand comes across digitally and how to engage with consumers in a different way digitally before they arrive, when they've arrived, and after they leave. And finally, just going back to this F&B experience, how to really, especially for food business hotels that haven't really had food as a core part of the offering, more something that they offer because they need to. I think that there's a real opportunity to expand on that, improve that, and make it a more central part of the overall guest experience.
So we all need to be a lot more nimble, but a lot of people have already started to be nimble, but the muscle that we need to build in, I think that's again something that I think is a really valid observation. I think it'd be good now to drill down a bit more into this whole talent shortage, and I'd like to pick up again with Eric, I think, on that topic, because I think that was a really interesting observation that you were making there, Eric, about the what's happening in the labour market. And do you think that the labour shortage may be here to stay in the light of the comment that you were making just now about people's changing perceptions and needs?
I do. Listen, I think sometimes we fall into the trap of looking at things from a siloed standpoint, assuming that what's happening in hospitality isn't happening in other sectors. I just read one of the Q&A, and they were asking, will the government intervene? My response to that is typically when you throw a party, the government's the last person to the party, and you're already asleep, and you've probably already woken up by the time the government have showed up. I wouldn't rely on the government to solve this problem. If the best analogy I would give with respect to what's happening is what's happening in tech. What's happening in tech is we've migrated from what the tech industry calls Web 2.0 to Web 3.0. Web 2.0 is this idea that you build a platform like the likes of Uber, Facebook, Airbnb, Instagram. Someone else, the platform owner creates the platform. Someone else contributes content to the platform, whether it's an Uber driver driving the car, whether it's Spotify and a musician providing music. That content creator makes nothing. The platform owner makes everything. And everyone was fine with that. Even the same with the law,
Eric. We provide content now too. The trick is, how do you get, what's the next stage? So it's across the board, isn't it?
Yeah, and so the world was comfortable with this idea that the platform owner made it all and the content providers made nothing. And what happened during COVID is a lot of the content providers, if you were an Uber driver, or for example, you were a musician, you made your money through other areas. So because of the fact that you couldn't tour, you couldn't make money on touring anymore. And so this idea that Spotify continued making all the money, you made nothing, wasn't a way that you couldn't survive off of that. So in response to that, what's happening is you saw the emergence of Web 3.0, which is this idea that instead of people going to the Amazons, going to the Ubers, you're seeing this emergence of mini ecosystems of 50, 100, 2,000 people working together to create a new platform where each one of the members who are providing the content are getting a piece of the action and no longer being comfortable with the platform owner keeping everything. And I think that movement of what you're seeing in tech is happening everywhere. I think people are, one, uncomfortable working for organizations that don't align with their belief systems. I think, two, to the extent that people don't like their jobs, they're waking up to the fact that I don't want to do this. My life has a little bit more meaning than perhaps what I've been doing. And to the extent that someone's not enjoying their job, they're getting up and leaving. And I think most of us are hoping that labor force will come back, because we've just all assumed, they've been living on checks from the government, they're going to come back. Most of them have found lives elsewhere. And so they're not, I think we've got to give up on this idea that they're going to come back. The key is, how do you create a work environment that attracts people that align with your views and are passionate about what you do? And if the response to that is, well, no one's ever going to be passionate about being a receptionist or being a server, that's not a response. That is a recipe for disaster. And so there are organizations out there, even within our industry, that have created a workforce and created a work environment where people love working there, even if it means they're not making tens of millions of pounds. It's irrelevant. It's what they do that needs to be comprised of meaningful work and the meaningful relationships around them. And I think that it's a stark realization, because we've been so comfortable as employers relying on paying very little and not having to worry about creating a work environment that actually matters.
I think, Eric, I mean, one of the key points there is around culture.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think you can say, well, it was interesting listening to Kate, who knows a lot more about the actual nuts and bolts of this and things like the 2-year hiatus. I mean, that's worrying, right? But ultimately, you have to create jobs that people want to do, and you have to create a culture that encourages the development of your people. And it doesn't matter whether you work in the law or whether you work in what I do or what Russell or Eric or Faraz does. And that's, every job needs that. And it's that sort of purpose-led or values-led business and culture that is needed, right? And I mean, in the hotel world, I'm pretty sure actually Eric's business is doing a pretty good job of it. But I mean, I see it in some of our tenants, people like 25 hours and are doing it and actually introducing 4-day week in some of the things in Germany, which you think, well, why are you doing that? But actually staff retention has been very good as a result of some of the moves that they have made. And you know, I think when you sort of think, how do we make the industry more attractive? I think there's probably a couple of things. I think there's a sort of the realization that things have changed, right? And that we have to do things differently and we have to work differently and we probably have to run hotels with fewer people. Maybe that means we can pay people more. Maybe we can create more worthwhile jobs as a result and embrace technology more. But I think it's got to come out of where we are today, but not saying it's going to be easy.
I think if I can pick up on that point, the one thing that I think we have to try and do is turn jobs into careers. And if we can give somebody who's coming into our sector, not just a job, but the start of a career, then I think we have a greater chance of retaining them. Yeah, we have to work very hard on getting the compensation right, getting the work-life balance right has always been a problem. When I started out, I was doing split shifts, and you know, my 2 days off started at 4 o'clock on one afternoon, and I was back then 2 days later at 4 o'clock to do the evening shift. So you know, we've got to change people's mindset as to what the business is all about, but really focus on giving them a career.
Russell, do you think that's a problem, particularly in the UK? That people always used to say, well, that's because in the UK, people don't see the hospitality sector as one that provides a viable career. If you're a French chef, for example, that would be completely different.
You're absolutely right. And it's something I've been banging on about for years. In this country, we equate service with servility. And if you're a waiter in France or Italy, that is a passionate career choice, but we've not yet been able to separate the delivery of good service with being servile. And I think that is partly, you know, at the education system, which doesn't give our industry enough space to be able to be understood properly for what it really is. So yeah, let's get the terms and conditions right, get the work-life balance right, and create careers for people that they can see progression and opportunity.
And as you say, we've been talking about this for years, Russell, and now it's been brought into sharp relief, hasn't it, with this great shortage. And I was just going to ask Faraz there to bring you in. Have you seen a reduction in, say, range and quality being offered by operators, particularly perhaps in relation to food service and delivery, as a result of labour shortages?
Absolutely. I mean, definitely due to labour shortages, also due to supply chain issues. We've seen cut down menus, restricted hours of operating, especially in kitchens where food isn't their core reason for being, and they're prep heavy. They had previously prep heavy or labour heavy menus. So yes, definitely we've seen that. And I think the way that we've seen some operators adapt to that is through outsourcing some of these things or sourcing new and innovative ways of getting some of that work offsite, so it's easier on the kitchen or a less qualified team to be able to create an exciting product.
And of course, all of this, we can't really talk about all of these changes that are happening without immediately, we already touched on at the beginning, looking at the whole topic of ESG. And Russell, do you think hoteliers can afford to ignore ESG, which many of them perhaps seem to still be doing or not having it still don't have it quite at the top of their agenda, when we hear that investors are walking away from deals where the whole topic isn't adequately addressed. I mean, we're hearing more and more of this, aren't we, that banks won't lend if you're, for example, if your scheme or your project isn't ESG compliant.
You're absolutely right. Investors and banks won't look at you eventually. And the hotel industry has an alarming habit of being late to the game with anything that is really important. In the years gone by, I would have said we were so far behind in the technology business. Everybody was still using a handheld word processor before they were able to use a computer. Anyway, what it is if we ignore ESG, then two communities will not want to have anything to do with us. First community is our guests. Second community is our staff. And we won't be able to attract the best people to us, whether they're guests or staff, if we haven't done enough to satisfy their requirements. And their expectations are very high. And most hoteliers have still got to learn that this is something that they need to be well ahead of.
Maybe Eric would like to comment on that. What do you see, Eric? How are you addressing this?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, because one of the observations that I'm making is that in response to what's happening within the labor pool and from an investment community, that there's been a knee-jerk move to approach this in a kind of a tick boxing exercise. Well, if we tick all the boxes, then that'll be enough.
Okay.
The reality is that the reason for why the labor pool is responding so vociferously in response to this is because it's something that they believe in at a very deep level. And so if they perceive that you're only doing this as a way to get it out of the way, or almost as a sales tool, I actually think you'll see a negative reaction to such a degree, because you'll be perceived as a hypocrite, that you don't actually really care about ESG. You're only doing it because you have to. Yeah. And so I would caution against, I think if it's not something that you care deeply about, we're all gonna have to look in the mirror and find ways to care about it, because if not, the bottom line will suffer.
Yeah. David, do you think there's a disconnect, David, between what people within, say, the middle to lower echelons of a company think, and what they want from their employment, and what their leaders are telling them that they are delivering, or how important this topic is to the industry leaders?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think ESG overall, for me, is the biggest change I've seen in my career in terms of impact on, particularly on the financial service, on the job that I do in terms of investing into real estate. It dwarfs COVID by multiple factors in terms of the impact it's going to have on how we invest and where we invest. So it's an enormous point, right? When you then take that into how perhaps some of the brands interpret some of that, you get some fantastic speeches at the Glasgow. There's loads of great speeches. It's not always followed up on the ground when you actually follow through to negotiating a management agreement or a franchise agreement, in terms of how that's really coming through, because lawyers will say, oh yes, but how can we actually, well, we can't do that. And if we write that in a contract, how can we be bound by that, and all of these sort of things?
I don't want to be bound by that, really, at the moment. No. That's the whole thing. There's a lot of sort of nice wording going into some of these contracts, but they don't tend to have bite, do they?
No, they don't. And look, you can understand why people take that view. And of course, it's very hard to take the view on the ground of, oh, I should agree to that, when actually you could set a precedent that needs to then be, lawyers love precedents, and you might sort of start to use that. So there is a sensitivity in that sense, but it's something which needs fundamentally to change, I think, in terms, and you go back to the delightful brand standards, and obviously I used to work at a very big brand company, and the brand standards are there for very good reasons, but they contradict and they'll conflict with matters which are ultimately should trump them in terms of ESG, right? So an ESG is not just, oh, we're going to change light bulbs, or we're going to take the shower gel out and put in, or take the plastic straws out, whatever it is. It's about in the fabric of the buildings. I mean, these are significant investments. So to get to sort of BREEAM excellent and outstanding certifications, you have to make a significant investment into the building, a significant investment into some of the infrastructure and the MEP and all of these things. So as a real estate owner, it's a huge point about how the buildings are positioned towards that kind of carbon neutrality over time. So, I mean, and we're just at the beginning, right? So actually the first thing is, do you measure all the data, right? And that sounds boring, but you kind of have to you have to start there so you can start to see the difference. And at the minute, to the tick box exercise, the first tick box is that you measured everything, right? But that's not industry standard. Then, you go back to the social side, that's about improving the jobs, about improving the sort of context of people. As I say, it's a big change, but it has to, from Eric's point, you have to go from, box tick, 5 box, okay, we're okay. It's like, no, this is actually, we have a sort of, we have a fiduciary responsibility to our investors. It feels to me like we have a fiduciary responsibility as investors to make sure that we're investing into the future of the buildings and also of the kind of everything that we do, right? And so it sounds like a bit grandiose, but actually it's kind of, this is why I say it's the biggest change that we've faced, because it is so large in terms of all the things it needs to do.
And I think personally, I think we're going to see a rapid escalation with this debate. I can already see it, because a lot of, for example, the big landed estates in London, they seem to be taking a lead and saying, right, we have these estates, we have a holistic approach, we have a policy, and if you want to be our tenant, you have to commit in your lease to embrace this policy. This is something we're seeing more and more, and it's also feeding through to management companies, management contracts. And I would also say, just to finish there, if you haven't heard about the work, anyone listening, of the Energy Environment Alliance, I would strongly recommend that you have a look there, because one of the great things that they're doing is a great social project, I would call it, which is putting a lot of people together to put a really impressive precedent bank in place that will enable companies to say, well, I do want to green up my management contract, or I do want to green up my banking documents. How on earth do I do it? So we're putting together with them a whole group of lawyers and other interested parties, and they will be widely available to the market, and hopefully that will help people move that one forward.
Karen, the one thing I'll say is that I think part of the challenge is the fact that it's such a broad topic that can feel so overwhelming that the knee-jerk response is to almost turn to someone on your team and say, can you take care of this? And I think the word ESG, I think sometimes we assume that it just has to do with the green movement. I mean, the reality is it's more of a mindset. It has to do with diversity. It has to do with, so I think many of us leaders, unfortunately, are going to be forced to have to research this on our own. And it's, it's the old adage of, biting an elephant one bite at a time. But I'm not entirely convinced that it is something that you can just outsource to your team member and assume that they can just take care of it. This is going to require every one of us sitting on, on this panel and the participants actually doing a deep dive on what these things mean to our team members and the measures that we can take in response to the green movement, diversity, and some of the other movements that haven't even hit but will hit in response to what's actually happening out there.
There needs to be total commitment, obviously, at CEO level, doesn't there? And not just box ticking, as you were saying. Thank you. I wanted to move on now to technology, digitalization, and perhaps disruption in its wider sense. And perhaps, Eric, while we have you on demute, I was wondering what your views are about use of tech and innovation, and perhaps even the broader topic of disruption. Do you think there could be another disruptive consumer product like Airbnb around the corner, for example, that's going to take us all off guard? Or
I think it's inevitable. Listen, I get it, but the larger you are as an organization, the harder it is to implement change, and the more, to a certain degree, that you hope that you're not forced to do so. And so the reality is, if you look at history tells us that we're about to enter the most disruptive era of our lives. And I think the challenge is when you hear the word technology, we collectively assume that it has to do with gadgets. But going back to
robots and gadgets in hotels.
Yeah. And so going back to the analogy that I'd given earlier about the Spotify. So I'm going to take that very simple example. In the example of Spotify created the platform, like Airbnb, and the musicians provided their content. The musicians made nothing. Spotify made everything. What happened, and the way the musicians made their money is they needed Spotify to raise awareness. And so in response to that, the musicians made their money on tours and in other facets. The issue was when COVID hit, these same musicians couldn't make money by touring. COVID precluded them from doing so. So the musicians just didn't starve, and they didn't just solely rely on the COVID checks, which is what we all assumed they did. What many of these musicians did is they created music, original content, and linked it to what people call an NFT, a non-fungible token. And it's basically an algorithm that if I go and buy that music, I'm buying the original song from, let's say, Justin Bieber, and I'm paying him £100,000. And now I own the rights to that song, but instead of it being drafted in a legal document, the legals are in essence drafted within the algorithm of the NFT, which means that every time I go and monetize that song by playing it elsewhere or selling it elsewhere, the algorithm is written in such a way that Justin Bieber, I'm using as an example, makes 10, 20, 30% of that music without having to document it every time and without having to monitor it. It's automatic. So in response to this,
in the art world as well, isn't it? Of course. Yeah.
Exactly. And so in response to this, you had musicians who were making nothing, making more now in this post-COVID world than they were prior, without having to tour. Now, that is this example of kind of the power shift moving from platform owner to content creator. I think the question we've got to ask ourselves is, it's one simple example of Web 2.0, 3.0. How will that impact hospitality? Will there be, for example, NFTs created by hospitality platforms that allow people, once they buy the NFT, they can go stay in any one of your hotels, and then they could take the NFT and sell it to someone else. I mean, it's very hard for us to comprehend what this means. But for those who aren't encumbered by legacy, there are people out there, and I get calls from some of my tech friends in New York who are thinking about this. Who are thinking about how to use NFTs, and I'm using that one of 50,000 technologies that people are working on how to monetize and disrupt the hospitality industry.
I think we need a whole other session on NFTs, don't we, in the hospitality sector? That's our first one for January. Faraz, I just wanted to bring you in there to see if you have any thoughts in relation to, I want particularly to focus in a moment on your expertise with dark kitchens, which is, I think, is a really interesting sort of standalone topic. But in relation to technology generally, what are your what are the ways in which you can see that tech can really help the sector in the year ahead in particular?
So, I mean, taking us back to, if we're talking about immediate opportunities, taking us back with the labour shortages, there are a number of ways we're already seeing hospitality operators with differing degrees of execution using things like ordering tech, room service tech, things like waste management, performance improvement systems to help drive operational performance in the front of house or their kitchens. I think there's ways that we can be using data more readily to help improve the way that we manage our labour at the moment, help reduce the amount of labour needed for certain transactions. That's happening already, and we've seen quite a varying degree of uptake.
And because I'm keen to keep to time here, I do want to ask you specifically now about dark kitchens, which is your thing that you've been working particularly. So what do you think is the best way to help operators do more with what they have? Are dark kitchens one of the solutions?
So we don't call them dark kitchens.
No.
What we do is our model is about helping operators rethink how their food and beverage operating model works. So it's first and foremost thinking about how to come up with innovative menus that serve their on-site customer in dining, in room. And this isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It's absolutely not. So this, what we do won't work for every single operator. And if you're a very specific F&B led operator with a Michelin starred chef, that chef will not want someone messing around with his menu. However, for mid-range hotels where they are struggling with food, they are struggling with digital content, branding, social media, the data to help drive that performance improvement, that's where we'll come in. And where I think there's an opportunity, kind of going back to building that muscle to deal with change, is kind of helping move some of the heavy lifting out of the kitchen, producing recipes that are easier to assemble with exciting ingredients that can come straight into the kitchen, but then also building delivery as a bolt-on for those times when there is capacity to de-risk the overall operating model. So if you imagine in the city centre hotel we talked about, if you're at a time on a Monday night or a Tuesday night, sorry, even a weekend in the city centre where you're at a low occupancy, you can then start to drive some extra income and connect with the local population. And going into if there was another lockdown or another pandemic, you do have that opportunity and the flexibility to engage differently with your food offer.
It's interesting. I was talking to a client of ours a couple of years ago who said that their most popular delivery item right at the top of the list was bottled water, which I found astonishing, followed, I think, second by a full English breakfast. I can't remember what the third thing was. And the most bizarre thing they had to deliver out was one of those tiny little sachets of Heinz ketchup in the middle of the night, just one. So you must be able to
Can I come in on the local side of it? Because I think it
Yes.
also picks up on a question that one of our distinguished audience members has asked us.
I saw that Rod had asked a question, and I was going to, because Russell, we were going to ask you here about other uses, and I see that Rod has asked.
He has.
Thinking of co-working meeting space and importantly F&B, what do the panelists believe are the key things a hotel must look to provide to encourage all-day business?
Well, I think one of the real opportunities for hotels, particularly with the trend of working from home. I'm not saying that we should send our staff home and have them do their work from home. I'm talking about when offices are allowing or encouraging, in some cases, their people to work from home. They're missing social contact, and hotels will allow and will encourage, I hope, their facilities to be used by the local community more, so that people can meet, so that people can have social interaction, so that they can perhaps use meeting spaces and banqueting rooms and so forth, configure them differently, encourage a sort of WeWork mentality where people can either go there because they haven't got the space at home to work, or they can go there to get social contact and meet locally based people, whether it's their own colleagues or others, so that they can really benefit from the new working regimes that they're all part of. And I think that's a tremendous opportunity for the hotel sector within its local environment to adapt their business model, to sell them something, whether it's a cup of coffee or whether it's a lunch, whether it's an afternoon tea or some other innovative product. And I think
involves staying overnight. In other words, it's using
and who knows? Some people might also use them to stay overnight. I mean, it's an amazing opportunity for the hotel business.
Now we've got sorry.
Maybe the piece though on co-working that. And we all know of certain hotel concepts in London that where you see crowds of people drinking one espresso a day in the lobby, and it looks very busy, right? And it's full of Apple MacBooks, whatever, and that's sort of the way it works. But it does create a sort of actually inviting atmosphere in a way for people to go in. Oh, well, it's actually busy. I want to go in there. Whereas most hotels, when you walk past, actually are pretty empty, right? So I think there's that. You probably could use things like co-working to drive a bit more demand and a bit more all-day usage, but it's never going to be an easy thing, right? It's a big challenge the hotel industry has always struggled with, right? But it's something to go for. I see there's a question for me further.
There is a question for you. Yeah. Eric, did you want to come
Yeah, I was
in
just going to piggyback off what
last
David.
one? Yeah.
Just what David was just said. Obviously we spend a lot of money on creating these co-working style venues within our hotels. I think caution I would say is that, we've all collectively been confined to our homes for far more extended periods of times than we ever had anticipated. And so what was once just a place to sleep has evolved into a place, our home, into a place we sleep, eat, socialize, work, gym. The list goes on. And so in response to that, we've been so comfortable working, living, socializing, playing within our homes, there needs to be a compelling reason for why we leave our homes. And so I think there's the assumption that just by calling your hotel, one's hotel lobby a co-working venue, that all of a sudden loads of people will show up. And what I would caution is that what we're seeing is that, yes, it works if what you're providing is an aspirational version, an evolved version of what they have at home. If it's equal to or worse, there's really no reason for why someone's going to meet in that venue. And so in a lot of cases, that does require additional investment, but everything we've discussed on this call requires additional headspace, investment, time, whether it's ESG, whether it's co-working, whether it's, I think, the hope that things are just going to go back to the way they are, I'm not convinced that they will.
Thank you, Eric. Now, I'm quite keen to take another question from the floor, and I think this one from Richard Eaton-Hart's quite a good one, really. David, if you could, be great if you could give us a brief answer to this one. And it's probably the latter part. Will lessors need to step in to carry out ESG upgrades to protect future real estate values? And how are you encouraging hotel tenants to make Capex investments at a time when cash flow and rental payments are scarce? Great question. Thank you, Richard.
It is a very good question. And I think it's something which, we invest more into continental Europe, where the leases are more the DAC and FAC or double net, whatever you want to call it, but we're responsible for the roof structure and a lot of the sort of MEP stuff, and that's where the big investment is required, and that's part of our landlord's responsibility. Now, in doing so, what we then have is make sure there is a green clause in the lease and actually an obligation on the tenants to invest. Lease we did at the beginning of this year, we included a sustainability reserve. So in addition to the FF&E reserve, there is actually a dedicated sustainability reserve. Now, both ourselves and the tenant contribute to that, and then that reserve has to be invested into sustainability, but I guess ESG matters overall. And I think you'll start to see some of these changes coming through. The other bit we see on the green side, say green loans or green bonds, and actually they can be cheaper financing than standard financing. So there is actually a sort of a valuation benefit in some ways from going down this route. But really for us, it's all got to be a partnership, right? So if it's just, a sort of relationship, which is, I'm the landlord and I've got a big stick and I can make you do, that never really works in our experience. And we've certainly seen that through the pandemic. And you've really got to work with tenants as partners. Mm-hmm. And that is the sort of key for us, is that sort of true partnership where it requires transparency, openness. So it's not making people do stuff. I guess it's in essence, encouraging is probably a very good word that Richard used in his question, to work together with our tenants to make the improvement. And actually it's taking them on that sort of educational journey that actually it's a beneficial thing to do rather than being burdensome. And
of course, the big issue that we're seeing all the time is that you're now having these things added into an FRI lease. So the FRI lease becomes even more onerous for tenants. But that's, again, this is it's a great subject, and one that we can perhaps explore in more detail on in a separate session next year. Green documents, or make it sound more interesting.
There'll be an NFT or something, right? So that they don't even need to be printed.
That's even more exciting. NFT session. So I've got one more question for everyone that I would just like, if you could please do a one-liner for me by way of a wrap for today. It would be great to go on for longer, but we're out of time, sadly. So my last question to everyone is, do you have a single piece of advice for hoteliers which in your view would best help them to weather the storms? I would like to be able to say showers, but sadly I don't think I can, predicted for 2021, or at least the first half of it. David, while I have you on the large screen, would you like to kick off?
I guess it's 2022.
Soundbite, please. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it is 2022. Why did I say 2021? I'm trying to lose 2021.
Well, we lost 2021 to COVID. Oh, look, I think all I could say is for people to just, to just try and be as optimistic as possible. And it's about, you're going to have to be resilient. It's going to be, I think 2022 is going to be better than 2021, but it's not going to be vintage by any stretch, right? So I think it's just continued resilience and just try and look at everything as an opportunity rather than a challenge. Maybe a tentative start to the Roaring '20s then. Faraz, what would you like to say on that point?
100%, kind of following on from David, staying positive, being adaptable, and looking for opportunities to de-risk your operating model where possible.
And that muscle point you made earlier, which I love. Thank you very much. Russell.
Very simply, react super quickly, anticipate the unexpected, and overcome whatever difficulties are encountered with a sense of humor and a sense of fun, because if we lose that, we've lost everything.
Eric, are you there? Can you?
I am. Yes, sorry about that. I accidentally. I think it's an exciting period. I think change can be incredibly exciting. The people who were going into the Renaissance were very fearful of the Renaissance, yet what it did to quality of life was amazing. And so I would be prepared for the change and recognize that the change can be very good, but the journey to getting to the experiencing fruits of that change might feel very destabilizing.
Uncomfortable. Yeah, great. Well, look, thank you very much, everyone. And there's some great ideas that have come up there, great comments, great thoughts. I'm just sorry we haven't had a longer time to explore everything. If there are some questions that we haven't been able to answer, we will look at those afterwards and perhaps contact people directly where we have your contact details. But for now, I'll just say thank you again, and I'll pass back to Chris Shepherdson to do a few closing remarks, if you could, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, everyone. That was a fascinating discussion. In fact, it's been, I don't know about you, but I found that a really fascinating last hour and a half. We've had some really interesting input. But thank you to Ollie Freestone, who's kicked off from AlixPartners, who came up with some fascinating data about how the world's changing, right down to the fact we're going to have 50 gadgets, or 50 smart gadgets, shall we say, pieces within our homes by 2030. I think that's correct. The fact we're going to have 7%, or only 7% of transactions will be cash within the next few years. And even the amount of time we're spending on the internet and on phones and how that's changing. This is all showing how the world is changing and what the challenge is and what the opportunity is as well. And actually how retail, we can learn lots from retail to bring into hotels. Here's another observation that Ollie made, which is very sound. So it is going to be a really exciting period of time. I think Kate, as Kate always does, Kate Nicholls, brings a real reality check to all the discussions. And she outlined the major challenges to face and actually how the next few months are going to be particularly difficult, and how we do face one or two real moments of truth, I guess, over the next quarter, which will tell us how the future will lie. And then the panel touched on some major points. I think the thing I got most out of it is actually we need to think differently. We need to be prepared to think differently. We need to be prepared to think fresh thoughts and actually learn from other industries and be prepared for what's coming. But it could be an incredibly exciting period of time. So on that note, I will say thank you to you all for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who spoke on that fascinating session. And I look forward to seeing you soon. But in the meantime, please, best wishes for the season and happy Christmas in advance. Thank you very much indeed. Good night.